Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's podcast. Inspiring leadership is the theme, and I'm already inspired by talking to the guest who you're now going to hear from. This was a lovely connection from Sandy Duckett, who said, this is a man you need to have on the podcast. And it is a referrer-only podcast. So I said, if you recommend Sandy, let's have him on. Done an awful lot in his life already, both as a businessman, a very successful entrepreneur, a fellow dyslexic. So we have much in common who loves a whole load of things around sport, health, well-being, but also has done a huge amount, as you're going to hear shortly, with the Prince's Trust, and but just has got a zest for life. So without further ado, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jonathan. So yes, I'm Jamie Waller, and I'm an entrepreneur, an adventurer, and also a philanthropist. I run a multitude of companies that I own the majority of, and also have an investment portfolio of a bunch of minorities. And I'm also currently the chair of the Prince's Trust and its enterprise program. So I've been quite busy for the last few years building up an exclusive group of UK-based entrepreneurs that through their time and money are supporting young, less advantaged people start, build, and grow their own business across the UK.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic thing you do, Jamie. And what was for you the attraction of the Prince's Trust? Did you have any experience in your background in life that made, I want to do something, I want to give back and send the lift back down?
Yeah, what a great question, because we haven't discussed this. But so as a young child, I grew up in Bethnal Green in East London. Unfortunately for me, my father was an alcoholic and spent a lot of time beating up my mother. So early memories for me consisted of a lot of screaming and shouting and fighting, and the police arriving on occasion, taking my father away. My mother, not having the confidence to leave him, found a local charity called the Imps Motorcycle Display Team, which is a military-themed display team based in East London for disadvantaged children. And that gave me respite. So it took me away from home every Friday night. I returned on a Sunday evening ready for school the next week. And it also took me away from home every school holiday. So from age 5 to 16, I was away for 20 plus weeks a year. But when I was about 9 years of age, the Imps ran into some financial difficulties and was about to close. And that meant 40-odd children were about to be returned to dysfunctional homes. But the Prince's Trust, along with a number of other leading charities, threw some money in as grants to keep the Imps alive. So when I was able and I sold my first business in 2016, and I made some real money and wanted to look at philanthropy more closely, I both went back to the Imps and became their title sponsor, of which I still am today. And I also got involved with the Prince's Trust originally as a donor and a patron.
Well, that's fantastic. And there's a special connection for me in that I saw the pictures on your site of the Imps. And of course, I was in the Royal Signals, and we have the White Helmets Motorcycle Display Team who you've got a close connection there. And my wife was in charge of the Royal Signals Display Team, which included the White Helmets, and the riders were a special bunch, and getting in there, it was really hard. And the skills that they needed, which of course the Imps needed and you needed, were very special. And it brought on a lot of leadership and talent. And of course, then there was, of course, just like in any organization, there were one or two of the gods who thought they were better than the others. And do you know that you're a first year and I'm a second year and I've got more experience than you? All this kind of ranking. Does that resonate at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jonathan, you got to think we were 40-odd boys from East London. So it was remarkably different to go into a display team full of such discipline and structure. So, at age 5, we were having to have our own kit inspections. Have you ironed the collar of your shirt correctly? Have you cleaned the soles of your boots? Room inspections consisted of people running their fingers over the top of wardrobes to make sure that you had dusted the room, not just cleaned the superficial stuff that you could see. And so that was quite a big learning curve, age 5, and also being away from home. But then by the time I was age 11, I became Lance Corporal. When I was age 12, I became Corporal, 13 or 14, a sergeant. And by the age of 16, I was team captain, which meant I was overall responsible for 45 boys and their discipline and what they did. And I also had a management team of 12 lance corporals, corporals, and sergeants that were ensuring that discipline was delivered consistently throughout what we did. And we would travel all over the country and sometimes the world, and we would put on displays, at Edinburgh Castle, for example, in front of 16,000 people. And the pride in getting to do that. I was fortunate enough to meet Prince Charles, age 9, and where we put on a private display for the royal family, and that sort of being given that confidence and for people to believe in you, but also to get that level of responsibility at a young age is it's just amazing. It delivers so much to so many people that were like me, that were a bit lost.
Well, and it really is an inspiring story. And who was to know that 5-year-old who was cleaning the soles of his boots would one day be chatting easily to the king, or having just returned from Necker Island, having spent time discussing your next book with Sir Richard Branson. Tell us a little bit about Necker Island, because I've always been a big fan of Sir Richard Branson, but from afar. You happen to have spent time training with him on his island with about 16 other leaders. So tell us a bit.
Yeah, so I've only just got back about 5-6 weeks ago, and I didn't really know what to expect, other than I thought Richard would be an interesting chap, and it would be great to spend some time with him. But when I got there, I'm fortunate enough to have stayed in some beautiful places around the world. But Necker is, and I know it sounds a bit cliche, but it really is something remarkably different. To own an island, it's sort of creating a country. And what's wonderful, what Richard's done to the island is, how it's self-sustainable, how we've got wind turbines on the northeast part of the island, how on the southwest part of the island we've got tons of solar, all sort of all disguised with vegetation and wildlife, and how there's animals everywhere, giant turtles, and donkeys and a dog running around, and it's just a flamingo beach, of around 500 flamingos on one side of the island. The island's only 62 acres, I think, in total, but it's very easy to be lost in this air of paradise. And then wrap around that you're generally with a bunch of like-minded people, 17 very like-minded people. It truly is just it's remarkable, it's exceptional, and Richard's done an amazing thing, and he's an amazing, lovely person and a great host as well.
Well, and he is indeed one that you and I and others do find so inspiring, and yet has a lovely humility about him as you do. So look, congratulations on getting invited and being part of that gang. Well, as you look at, without mentioning the names of any of the others, but as you looked at that group of individuals, what was it that struck you about them as characters, and the way they behaved and the qualities that they had?
So everybody was remarkably thoughtful, and that really struck out at me, that it wasn't a bunch of go-getting, high energy, let's succeed at any cost people. They were very thoughtful. Each had their own contact or attachment to philanthropy in their own way, either their own foundations or various other things. And I guess there was a sense of maturity, and I guess that's you're not invited to Necker, I guess, if you're going to behave inappropriately and not be that way. But it was just lovely, and met a good bunch of friends from that trip, who some of them will remain friends forever, I'm sure.
I think that's just almost like back into the Imps, and when you did that experience together, how much it bonds you. You're also going to be with one or two white-collar psychopaths who you think you can't wait to get away from them. But any organization you're in, you'll have that share of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I was just thinking, one of the guests I interviewed was the managing director of the Hoffman Institute UK. Have you ever come across the Hoffman Institute?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I was just thinking with what you and many of the members of the Imps went through, and I found that a brilliant program that I went through in December, and probably in my 61 years, the most powerful personal development program I've ever done. I just wondered if you'd ever done it or thought of doing it.
No, I haven't. But I am a life learner, although I I left school prior to even sitting a GCSE, but I found education much later in life through business. In 2010, when I did my first business course at Cranfield University, and that was difficult for me because I was very nervous, turning up at a university thinking, what am I going to expect? I'm dyslexic. Is this going to work for me? But Cranfield made me feel remarkably well at home, and it delivered so much to me. And since Cranfield, I then went off and did an exec education at Stanford and one at Berkeley. And then finally, I signed up to do my executive MBA at the London Business School. And I'm very proud that I'm the only person to enter the executive MBA program that didn't have a GCSE, because obviously it's a postgraduate course to do an MBA. You should have a degree. You certainly should have some A levels and probably sort of 2 handfuls of GCSEs, but I went along with some A3 boards and did a presentation to the admissions team there on why it would be good for them as a brand to take somebody like me with 0 education and accept them on the MBA program. So I'm a lifelong learner. I always have coaches in my life for both fitness and business goals. And I'm a strong believer in using these tools and frameworks to improve life.
Yeah, well, I love that, and I feel a fellow spirit in you. And the other thing that we were chatting about was your love of health and well-being, and clearly you keep yourself in good shape. Let's have a talk on that. Let's just go straight into that, because I think that whole area of health, because we've got to be business athletes as well as personal athletes, because if we're going to perform well and think well, our body's got to be in good shape. We were talking particularly around the whole thing. You've been on the Zoe program. Where do you want to begin? I'm just interested in your learning of some of the latest research that's coming through about how we should look after our fitness, our health, and what to do to help our lifespan match our health span.
Yeah, so I think, it's a great, I love talking about this subject. And actually, my whole time on NECA, I think Richard and I spent more time talking about health and well-being than we spent talking about any other subject. And it's interesting because, when I grew up, I'm 44 now, but sort of being an 80s child and a 90s entrepreneur, there was almost this badge of honor of little sleep, working 20 hours a day. I only need 4 hours sleep a night, etc., etc. So there was almost, you were celebrated for being unhealthy. And what I love about the business world now is how that is truly changing. People no longer want to celebrate that. It's important to think about sleep, etc. And so I do enough. Obviously, I love to keep fit. I have a HIIT workout, CrossFit type workouts 6 or 7 times a week. I run a couple of times a week, and I also walk a lot. I love walking. So I'll do a bunch of work calls every day. Actually, I just did some before this podcast for an hour, an hour walk, and do a couple of calls. So I think for me, exercise doesn't need to be as much as I do it. People don't need to go to the gym. I probably do an hour and 30, an hour and 2 hours of exercise, some form of exercise a day. And I recognize that people don't have the time for that. But actually, the importance of walking, which hardly anybody does anymore, jumping in the car from place to place, and trying to design your life where walking has to become a fundamental part of it. So Chris Evans, the radio DJ, has a good sort of life hack for this, which is, he purchased a parking space for his car 5 miles away from the radio station. So that's where he parks, and then he runs to the radio station, and then he either runs back or he gets the tube back because he can't be bothered to run, but he had to run there in the morning, and he drives his car home. So you don't need to go and buy a parking space 5 miles away from your office, but there's many simple improvements. I talk to my wife about this a lot because we've got 2 children, 7 and 6. Time is not a luxury that she has all the time, but to be able to get to school, pick up 30 minutes early and go for a walk, right? You're getting less traffic because everybody else is rushing to get to school, pick up at the same time. So you've missed all the traffic, which means your stress levels are lower. You've got 30 minutes to have a walk. before you pick up the children, which is a bit of headspace before you got two children in the back of the car screaming and shouting. And I really quite like those simple hacks that you can put in, you know, never using the escalator. If you use the escalator, use it as an opportunity to take 2 steps at a time while walking up those stairs. And I think that's really important. And you and I touched base a bit earlier on about protein, the importance of protein. I think that's the one thing that I find is the most simple change that anybody in life can make. Every single person that I ask the question to about protein are not getting enough protein. And, you know, you should be getting sort of a gram of protein per pound of weight. And it's remarkable. And it's not just about, and you don't need to go buying protein shakes and protein bars, because obviously most of that stuff's all processed and it's terribly bad for you anyway. But there's a remarkable difference in how your body digests protein. So, for example, if you were having an English breakfast in the morning and you decide to go for the toast and the beans first, and then the meat, which is the higher protein content, your body will digest less protein than if you went for the meat first. And that general rule to think about is go for the fiber, go for the vegetables first, then go for the protein, then go for the carbohydrates. The benefit of that too is that you digest less of the carbohydrates, which is really not what you want to be digesting lots of as well. So simple hacks, not getting people to change much. Just change how you do these things and they will have a remarkable impact. My wife, she won't mind me for saying this, but she's one of those people, you know, fad diets after pregnancy and stuff like that. And when we simply sat down one day and I said to her, you need to eat more. You need to stop doing 1,000 calories a day. You need 2,000 calories a day, but this is how much protein you need to undertake too. It transformed her life. Now she eats whatever she wants to eat, but she eats it in a certain order and she makes sure she gets enough protein. And it's been life-changing because, you know, weight certainly for probably more women than men comes with terrible mental health issues, you know, if they're not confident in their weight after birth and stuff like that. So fixing this stuff is just wonderful. But it's not spoken about a lot. So protein for me is the biggest single game changer that anybody can take.
Yeah, and I'm completely with you, and I'm just like you. I'm constantly learning and reading various or listening to various audiobooks about it, and very interested in the whole functional medicine we talk about, Dr. Mark Hyman, and a lot of the work on longevity, which I think is really interesting, but obviously interests Richard Branson as well. When you're going for your protein, because there's, you know, various debates about, you know, if you could tend to be with your turkey and your chicken and your fish, maybe some of the lentils, but I don't find that gives me so much wind. I tend to avoid the beans and lentils. Having been vegan for a while, it really got my gut. I never quite adjusted to that, even after a year. But I tend to avoid the steaks and the heavier meats because it takes so long to digest, particularly as an evening meal. But what's your favorite? What do you tend to go for to get your protein?
So yeah, I mean, white lean meats are obviously the winner there. But I think what's important for me is I want to get at least 50 grams of protein by brunch. So I tend to have brunch rather than breakfast because I fast for 16 hours and eat in 8. And I like to work out fasted. So I go to the gym in the morning and then come home and have breakfast around 10:30, 11 a.m. So brunch. But I tend to want to ensure that that's high in protein. So, you know, Greek yogurt, lots of berries, lots of nuts, and making sure that you can get around. It's not easy. You can get 40 grams of protein in that breakfast. And if you have to, sometimes I do have protein powders that are whey that you can throw in there if you need an extra 20 grams. And sometimes I will do that. But I try to get my protein from natural sources. But what I have worked out, if you don't get the right amount in the morning, it's really difficult to catch up throughout the rest of the day, right? So, you know, I'm trying to digest a lot of protein, and it's easy to get 500 grams protein in an evening meal. It's really difficult to get that anywhere else. You know, big steaks and stuff like that are easy. So, but I think for people to be mindful that, you know, nuts are a good source of protein. Yogurt is the right yogurt, obviously, but and try and avoid all of this low fat stuff, which is, you know, taking out all of the good stuff and putting in loads of bad stuff.
Yeah.
In some sort of effort to convince you're doing good for yourself.
And they one of the things I find as a very useful hack is that the 4Ks: kefir, kombucha, what is it, kimchi, and sauerkraut.
Yes.
And because a bit like you, we're both fans of the Zoe process and looking at our gut microbiome, and mine's different from yours and different from my wife's, and yours is different from your wife's. But actually, the fact you're together, it makes there's certain elements of them that they are quite similar, because you're in the same family, and your children, who are 7 and 6, giving them the chance to be around animals and puppies. And I've got 2 in here who are luckily quiet at the moment, but we're looking after our children who are 30, and our son's 13, he's in the police, and he's got his wife, and their 2-year-old and 1-year-old are living with us. The whole family is living with us at the moment till they move house to near us here. But it is interesting giving them lots of chance to play with the dogs and stuff, and they might get the bugs and things, but actually you want them to get that. But I think it's very interesting in the usual things I think about: eat, move, sleep, breathe, focus, prosper. I think that's little things that you would relate to in how you've lived your life. But we've talked about eating and just the importance of real food, that someone wearing a hat and a white cape or a white scientist coat, if they made that and it's got stuff you can't read. I mean, broccoli has 1 ingredient on the back of it. It's pretty simple, you know what
Yes.
that is. So the eating, I think we both get that, and just the damage that the ultra high processed standard American, standard British diet has done. 1950, 1% of people were obese. Now in the UK, 34%. America, it's 50%. There's as a link, and big food and big pharma have a lot to answer for, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, as I age, I'm getting more and more liberal in my thought process, which is a good thing, because I probably wouldn't have liked the 20-year-old me much now. But I think it's disgusting. I think back to the people and where I grew up in East London, and my parents' lifestyle and what they fed me as a child. And the food industry are incentivized to produce food that has the longest possible shelf life, to enable them to make sure they sell it and not dump it for profit. But then they also add stuff to this processed food that gives you cravings for more food, which is obviously they're incentivized to do, for you to, one, buy more of that certain product so that you eat more at that one time, but also that you get hungry again soon after. And then there is absolute scientific links to this processed food being responsible for many diseases. So but it's just, I mean, it's disgusting that we let it happen. And in the UK, we're better than the US in some of our food standards and stuff, but we're far from perfect. And it's the poor and the less educated that suffer. And I find that really quite tough. People like us are very fortunate, probably, that we can not only educate ourselves and buy the right food, we can probably spend more money on making sure it's organic and free range and the various other things that we believe are good for our bodies. If you're on income support or working as a cleaner or helping old age pensioners, as my mother was, she didn't have that luxury. And I think that's a shame, because I think if government cannot have the responsibility of making sure that we do right by everybody, not just a select few, then what purpose do they have? And I would like to see a lot more done about this, because you mentioned I've got a blood glucose monitor on now. Is anybody in my mum's era getting a blood glucose monitor and monitoring themselves? No, they're not, because it's available to those of us that are educated on it, can then afford to act upon the data it gives us, etc., etc. I think it's a real shame. It's a real shame. We've got an NHS that's collapsing under the pressure of all this stuff, but then we've got a food industry that are creating pressure on the NHS, and we've got a government that's too busy to look at the food industry, or because of the power of it, won't do anything about it anyway. And this spiral of the wealth gap getting bigger and bigger, the poorer and the less educated being, quite frankly, just treated very, very badly in society. It will end one day in riots and unrest, and that will be terrible for us all.
I think you're exactly right, Jamie. And it does concern me that it's almost it becomes a conspiracy in some ways. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but but that big food are encouraged, as you say, to make this food, in particular when they're acting on leptin and ghrelin, which keeps that hunger and then has an impact on you and wanting more of the wrong stuff, and making it just the consistency of mother's milk, like an ice cream, which has just the right fat and just the right sugar that you want more and more and more of it. Of course they want to sell more. They're in the marketing game. They've got to make a profit from it. But as you say, the wrong people in society are not informed about the impact on them, and they go for something. The longer the shelf life, the shorter your life. And as you were saying, and then of course, big pharma, people that go to the doctor and they go, give me a pill. And so they want a pill for something, but that's actually not going to go upstream and solve the problem that they're still taking the shit food that they shouldn't be having in the first place, which is causing them to have a dysfunctional metabolism. The American statistic, 93.5% American are metabolically dysfunctional. I don't think Britain's much better. And so that affects mental health. So we're going, oh, mental health's going up. Yeah, it's because what you eat has an effect on your brain energy. So I think with the lobbying of people like the big pharma companies and the big food companies, they have marketing budgets the size of the GDP of a small country. Whereas broccoli, do they have a marketing budget? No, they don't. They just sell broccoli. But people go, I don't want that, but I want another big, giant tub of ice cream or fizzy drink or whatever it might be, knowing that it's not good for us. We also touched on sleep, you and I. And you said early in your life that you'd struggled with sleep. It's something that I'm recording on my Oura ring. I've had a Whoop strap. I've got my Apple Watch. So you can get a bit obsessive about data. And now I've got like you, I've got the wearable glucose monitor on the back. I'm getting really excited, and I've got a solar panel on the roof, and I'm recording how much sunshine I'm getting. I'm getting really excited. But in all seriousness, the as we're looking at things like sleep, what I've found is that I'm just particularly I'm older and I've got a sort of enlarged prostate, which is a sort of personal thing, but I'm not getting as much sleep, and I'm perhaps getting up a few times during the night, and the deep sleep and the REM, which I want, until I found I did much more exercise. I'm doing endurance bike riding at the moment, going to raise money for Help for Heroes and my wife's charity, which is Violence Against Women and Girls, which is called the Inspiring Leadership Foundation, which we really care deeply about getting people out of that trap of county lines. And we work with serious organized crime part of the Home Office to help get these girls out of this grip of this environment that you saw in Bethnal as you were growing up, and helping them get a chance and getting some mentors, probably a bit like the work you do with the Princess Trust. But I just want to sort of help people with this whole idea of sleep. I found that actually I'm taking what is it? It's almost like the cannabinoid bit of cannabis, but the CBD oil.
Yes.
And I take that, and actually I have deeper sleep and I have more REM sleep. I don't know whether you've tried that in your various.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I've got a wonderful story about sleep, actually, if you wouldn't mind me sharing it, because it's a recent recent dialogue with Richard Branson, who we've already spoken about. But so I arrived on Necker just some weeks ago, and on day 2, Richard says, anyone up for a proper bike ride tomorrow on one of the neighboring islands? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So Richard and I, the only 2 people with enough strength to get up some of these hills. So him and I are off at the front. The others are all being picked up by the support vehicle, and they're now sat in a minibus. So it just happens that it's Richard and I cycling for a few hours in the morning. And we're going up this hill, and I said to him, I thought I'd read somewhere that he'd had some difficulty with sleep. So I said, how are your sleep? And he said, perfect. Do you have an issue? I said, yes, I sleep for 4 hours a night, 2 hours in the beginning, I'm up for a few hours, and then 2 hours again. And he said, oh, you really need to resolve this, Jamie. He said, I've been sleeping well now for 23 years and it's changed my life, and et cetera, et cetera. So we had this great Chat. We get back on the boat, go back to Necker, don't think anything more of it. Lunchtime, we're sort of going down to the beach for lunch. Richard comes rushing over to me, taps me on the shoulder and says, I've written down a few things that we spoke about today about sleep, which might help you. Here you go. And he handed me this scrap of paper with his handwriting on it. And I was like, Richard, that's really kind of you. Thank you. And I thought, how lovely of him to have gone back home, had his shower, had his breakfast, and thought about this, and then came and tapped me on the shoulder. Anyway, didn't think anything more of it. The following night at dinner, we're all having some pre-drinks at one of the bars. And Richard comes up to me, he arrives, he comes straight up to me again. He's like, Jamie, you remember I was telling you about that TEDx talk? And I said, yes. He said, anyway, I remembered the name of it. I watched it again. And here are the key points that you need to think about and focus on. And I said to him, you watched it again? What, today? And he went, yes. And I said, rather than just give me the name to watch it myself. He was like, well, I knew there was loads of stuff in there that was not that useful. So I just thought I'd give you the useful parts.
Wow.
So when I left Necker, I said to Richard, I don't know if you realize what you were doing, Richard, but by doing that, you've made it absolute vital that I now act upon this advice and do something about my sleep. So I got back from Necker, I appointed a sleep doctor. And actually, I've been working with a sleep doctor for 3 weeks. And this week, every single night this week, I'm only allowed in bed for 6 hours a night. It's part of this training program we're doing. I have slept for 6 hours every single night this week. I've got an appointment with him again tomorrow morning. Last week, I was restricted to only being allowed in bed for 3 hours a night, which was pretty miserable. But I'm going through this program, and this doctor believes that he'll get me to 7 hours sleep a night within the end of this program, which is 6 weeks' time. But already it's changed my life. 6 hours a night is a vast improvement on 4. But I think it's a wonderful story because it goes to show you asked about Richard earlier on, what sort of character this chap is. So this is a chap that's overly busy, especially with Galactic and Orbit and everything else that's been going on of recent weeks. But when I re-watched the program and wrote down some notes and then brought them up to me and handed them to me in a bar, it was a remarkable experience, but it absolutely meant that I should focus on it. But going back to the subject of sleep, so for me, I like to keep fit. I like to stay healthy. And I know that sleep is pulling in the opposite direction for that. You know, the muscle growth is not the same if you don't get enough sleep, and you know you're not repairing. You're going into a workout the following day. So I knew all this, but I just didn't know what the answer was. And I've used CBD oil and use it quite frequently, magnesium tablets. Excuse me. But for the last week, with my 6 hours sleep a night, I've actually stopped the CBD oil. Because I found it was putting me into a very light sleep rather than a deep sleep. And I've been taking a supplement called GABA.
Yes.
And that has been completely life-changing. So GABA is recommended for people with dyslexia and more particular ADHD who have overactive minds of a night. And it sort of gives you the effects of that alcohol gives you, but without the terrible side effects of alcohol. So it calms your mind, lets you get into a deep sleep quite quickly, and it's been remarkable.
That's very interesting because I have a fascinating nutritionist, Barbara Cox-Lovesey, and she recommended something which had GABA in it, but I haven't found a way of getting GABA over the counter, or do you have to get prescribed it?
No, you can buy it over the counter, and so I can't think of the name of the company that I was recommended to get it from. You can Google it, and it will. You can buy it over the counter. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting, particularly because you didn't, and the key parts, as you say, the deep sleep is so very important, and the rapid eye movement, the dream state. That's fascinating. Now, I want to go back to the entrepreneurial side of you, because many people listening are from whole walks of life in about 125 different countries. Many of them business leaders themselves or aspiring business leaders. How did you become an entrepreneur? I heard in the early days, and what have been the businesses that you've set up and that you're doing now?
So I left school at age 16. I was dyslexic, and when I was at school, it wasn't really diagnosed. You were just considered to be thick, disruptive, or something in between. So I left school without sitting a single GCSE on the basis of I just needed to get out and get a job. And I set up my first business age 16, cleaning people's windows. I went and bought some ladders and a bucket, and I went knocking door to door, and took on new customers every few minutes, and that was great. And I ran that for a year, and I sold it a year later in the classified ads of a newspaper for £5,000. And I used that £5,000, and I went and bought half a dozen cars at an auction and started selling cars. I rented a piece of land next to a shop in Southeast London. And next minute I was a car salesperson. And, you know, that went reasonably well for a few years before Transport for London came along and put double red lines stopping people from parking outside the piece of land. So I loved working for myself. I always was full of ideas, and I went from that to setting up an outsourced debt recovery company. So we worked with governments around how you can, coming from Bethnal Green, from a poor background, I was very focused on how people are treated fairly when they owe government money. And what I had witnessed is that they weren't, and that the government were giving some companies the authority to go and terrorize people and cause severe hardship, you know, because sometimes the effects aren't always noticeable on what happens when a debt collector turns up at someone's house. There's obviously the noticeable ones. Oh, they're vulnerable because they're a single mother, unemployed, etc., etc. But no one was really talking about, well, what happens if it's the wife who hasn't paid something and then the husband beats her up when the debt collector leaves? What happens if the debt collector turning up 5 times in a month creates a breakdown of the marriage and then the spiraling effect thereafter, or the mental health issues? So we built a very successful business that focused on ethical debt recovery on behalf of government. So how could you try and protect people from being terrorized by those that were merely looking for profit? And I sold that business in 2016. And then I took all my learnings from that business and divested it into a technology platform and went and sold it to the creditors direct, which was, we no longer want to be involved in the collection process, but what we want to do is help you manage the collectors to ensure that they are doing it correctly and people are being protected. So as I said earlier on, I've become very liberal as I age. I'm very focused on treating people fairly, the poor not being persecuted. And just through some people's circumstances shouldn't mean that they are terrorized or punished severely, because the effects that you don't see of that are true. You know, people in debt do commit suicide. People in debt do get divorced. People in debt do bury their head in the sand and do silly things, you know, turn to alcohol, turn to drugs. And it's not spoken about much, but it should be, because generally when money is owed to government, it's not a cash flow issue, it's a balance sheet issue. So there should be absolute no requirement to rush that collection process, in my view. You know, slowly catch a monkey. It's a balance sheet issue, not a cash flow issue.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear what you talk about, because I think for the layman, they just attach debt recovery to the bailiffs coming round, the heavies taking all your stuff. And it resonates very strongly, because my wife Lee talked about, as she was growing up, her mum had to get out of an abusive relationship and should have been paid for her 2 children by the father, but wasn't, and was too proud to ask for it through the court system. So she struggled on her own. But Lee remembers many a time hiding behind the sofa with her mum going, shh, as the bailiff was knocking on the door, looking for the money that they couldn't pay. And it stuck with her, you know, all her life. It stayed with her, which is why, you know, she, having been through tough times, is now paying back. So she's trying to help people who are going through violence against women and girls, and also those who are the most unfortunate, to give them a start in life and help them you know, get on the ladder so they can look after themselves. And that's agency. And also that the charity Inspiring Leadership Foundation works in Africa. We went to the slums of Nairobi and also to KwaZulu-Natal, where just a small amount of money into the pot in this in the hut that we were in, you know, would allow them to do some microfinance between the different wives, because they wouldn't drink all the alcohol. That if they gave the money to the husbands, the wives looked after it, and they made sure the children got school shoes and things like that. But it is interesting. You've got deeply involved in the Prince's Trust, and how does a charity like the Inspiring Leadership Foundation get support from something like the Prince's Trust? What is their way? Because, you know, Lee's charity's been going about 8 years. They've got so much need out there, but they haven't found a way of getting the sufficient sponsorship for all the programs. They only need about 160 quid a girl. to actually get them through the program? What's the way of people doing that?
Yeah, I would say I think it's a true problem post-COVID, right? So, I also sat on the board of a charity called Breast Cancer Haven that was a COVID victim, unfortunately, and is now gone. But these smaller charities, which are in some cases are the better ones because they really do get to the grassroots, of some of these issues, are just terribly struggling with funding. I'm very fortunate to be chair of the Prince's Trust, where people want to be involved with the Prince's Trust because of the brand associated with it. And I should point out, the Prince's Trust is a very small charity. It seems a lot bigger on the outside. I mean, we turn over about 70 odd million pounds a year, and about 88 pence in every pound goes to supporting young people. But the Prince's Trust and other larger charities do have partnership programs that you can apply to be part of, and they will, if it suits their dynamic of who they're trying to support, then they will help, the same way they did with the imps. But I've also the imps is still running today, which is a tiny charity. We turn over about £65,000 a year and help 40 odd children a year. And I've personally been involved in lottery funding applications for that charity on 6 occasions, of which all of them have failed, because on the face of it, it doesn't support enough people, or the diversity is not enough. I mean, it's terrible. If an organization like Cancer Research or the Prince's Trust applied for a lottery grant, they would tick all the boxes. They would be able to fill out a good application, and they probably would get the funding. But what's happening with these grassroots levels, what I would like to see a bit more often is some organizations, like a trade association. There should be an association for small charities that can run this process for them, that can bring them together and say, well, you don't need to do the application yourself. If we get 6 like-minded charities and we can do the application as a consortium, then we're going to tick all the boxes and we're going to get the funding. And I think that's the future for smaller charities. And it needs that type of trade association to come in, but be the commercial mindset behind the smaller charities, because they deliver wonderful things.
They do, and you're exactly right. I mean, just for example, seeing Lee work for the last 8 years, and she'll work until 3 a.m. She's not getting paid for it as the CEO. She does it on the side of her desk of her day job as a coach and a facilitator and a speaker. But many of the volunteers give their time. Some get a little bit of money that we scrape together, but it's learning from first principles all over again, because it's hard to find where to learn and how to apply for funding. And of course, the other thing is, because everybody's trying to do their own thing and they feel strongly about maybe a daughter who's died of a certain illness, and they'll start a charity for that they can end up being competitive with other charities because they think it's a small pie, and is almost a scarcity mentality rather than abundance mentality. Whereas what Lee has found, she's often go, let's collaborate, let's work together, your charity and mine. And some of them go, really, what's the catch here? What's in it for you? She goes, well, let's just all work together. We're trying to help people in society, but it almost makes them fight against each other. But look, thank you for all that you're doing for society in what goes on. Let's have a little bit of a talk about, looking back at your life and some of the things you have. Let's talk about proudest moments. Both, I mean, I imagine it's, your 2 children and, being married and things like that, but I'll wait to hear from you. And then maybe a dark moment. You mentioned about your late mother, that there could be certain moments which are dark. And what did you learn from both the proudest and the darkest moments, Jamie?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the proudest moment is always having children. It really is. I mean, you can't ever tell someone who doesn't have children the joy that comes with having children, because no one ever quite gets it. But it is just completely life-changing in every way. But also, I must say, Jonathan, I'm also a very proud moment was to be asked to be chair of the Prince's Trust and their enterprise network. To go from a very disadvantaged background and we grew up in a 2-bedroom flat above a shop in Bethnal Green, where my mum still lived until she passed, to then representing our king, as I have done for the past few months or slightly longer since his mother, the Queen, passed. It's a real, for me to have gone from requiring the Prince's Trust support as a child to now leading the drive for getting support to help other young children or kids like me is a very, very, very proud moment. So every time I stand up on stage, I was asked to talk at a party on behalf of the King for the coronation, and a few hundred people in a room. There's me talking, being asked to talk on behalf of the King. That's a remarkable turnaround in life.
Who would just stay with that for a moment? Who would have thought, back there when you were dealing with, tough time with father and his drinking and mum struggling in that abusive relationship, and you trying to get away from it all, doing the imp biking? Who would have thought that there you would be, working with the King on behalf of a project that he started? And in your, just briefly before we go onto the darkest moment, in your occasions when you've met the prince as he was then, now the King, what sort of qualities stand out in him? Because I imagine he's an inspiring. We ought to get him on the podcast. Perhaps you should mention it to him. Next time you speak. So I think I've got a recommendation for you. I think you should share your story. What qualities stand out from your meeting of him?
So he's the King is remarkably thoughtful, so he comes prepared, which I know sounds, people go, well, of course he does, you get a brief before he rocks up. People always say, oh, he remembered me, and people go, oh, he didn't remember you, he was told before he walked in the room, and of course he was. But when you're told to remember somebody that you met 6 months ago, and here's a brief bit of information on them, you still got to carry that with you, make sure that you don't get the wrong person and stuff like that. And he's remarkably good at that, and that's not easy. It's sort of that ability of actors to be able to learn their lines and remember them so well, no matter what else is going on around them. But what he has this remarkable ability to make you feel welcome, to make you feel that you deserve to be there, to make you feel comfortable. Actually, I remember the first time I met him, he said, Jamie, I wanted to thank you for, coming a full circle of being helped by the Trust and now giving your time to the Trust. And I hear that you've done some amazing inspirational talks for some of the young people. And I said something along the lines of, oh, that's the least I can do. You can't shut me up when I get going. And he turned back around and said, and actually I have heard that too, or something. It was, that ability for him not to be stiff, for him to be dynamic with his thoughts, but be warm with them too, is just lovely. He does make you feel very, very welcome. I'm without doubt, I'm very aware that I'm very privileged to have been asked to serve as I have, and to be able to be, the Enterprise Network at behalf of the Trust. I'm labeled as the founder and the chair of that, and that's a title that will never go, and something I'm immensely proud of, and I hope my children are proud of too.
Yeah, and for those who want to have a pop at the royal family, I think you ought to get to know them and have met them before you actually have a pop at them. My two occasions which have stayed in my memory, once was meeting Diana, Prince of Wales, and the other one was when I got my MBE and went to get it from the Queen. And on both occasions, they had the ability to make me feel like I was the only person in the room that mattered. Now, that's a real skill, because I wasn't by any means, I wasn't getting knighted or anything like that. As awards go, I was at the bottom rung of the awards, but they knew about me, or they'd learnt their brief. They didn't have an earpiece. They didn't have someone whispering, oh, this is Jonathan and he's done. Yeah. And the Queen talked to me about what I'd done and the things that led to the award. And I had that 2 minutes, and then she shook your hand and gently pushed you away. And then you were told that the gentle push away is stop hanging onto her hand, let go. She's got to meet somebody else. But it is a tremendous experience. And that to me is inspiring leadership, that you care enough that you'll learn about somebody, you'll make eye contact, you'll listen to them. And this is all we really want, Jamie, isn't it? We want to be seen, and we want to be heard, and just treated with dignity, which is a born right of everybody, whatever your background. What do you think?
Oh, it's remarkable. They do have that wonderful ability, and all of them. I've met Princess Anne on a couple of occasions, and and the princes, and they all have that ability, and it's a real nice thing that they carry with them. And yeah, I feel very, very privileged. I come to an end. My role comes to an end in a couple of months' time, having served 3 years, and and I'm proud of what I've achieved, but I'm looking forward to some time back to myself. But it's just been wonderful, and it's been wonderful to be part of. And I guess my lesson from that is that none of this would have been possible unless I thought to myself, I want to give back, and that's and it doesn't need to be in the big. You don't need to become chair of the Prince's Trust to deliver value back to society. It can be very, very small, but I think I've got more from giving back than I've got from anything else I've ever done in life. It's truly remarkable.
And thank you for what you've done and the service you give. Let's go for a moment for a darker spot on how you handled a darker moment in your personal life, or could be as well your business, because we all have setbacks in business as well as we do in our personal life. And a bit like the Stoic philosophy, it's not the fact what happens to you, it's how you handle what happens to you that marks you out from the average people. What is your story, Jamie?
Well, I've got one that crosses both spheres, actually, which is in around 2014, or it was 2014, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and my mother and I were very close. We were best friends. We'd been through a lot together, me as a child and my mum as my mother, and we remained that close right up until she passed. But when she was diagnosed with lung cancer, I decided that I would go and move in with her and spend those last 12 months to 14 months with her, rather than trying to support her from afar. And I just thought, if there's ever an opportunity to do the right thing, this was it. So I was living with my mum, who refused to leave her 2-bedroom flat above a shop in Bethnal Green, because for her that was home. She was still renting it. I was trying to convince her to come and live with me instead. I was living in leafy Hampstead, right next to the common there, and the Heath, and she wanted to remain in Bethnal Green. So I went back, lived in Bethnal Green with her. It was a terribly tough time watching my mum go through that, and losing her hair and taking her to hospital appointments, knowing that it was all leading to one final destination of death quite soon thereafter. But I was also trying to run my business at the same time. And I was, relying on people more than ever in my business to help me with that. And it was quite strange that one day I left the board meeting, and my finance director at the time, who had been with me for about 6-7 years, said to me on my way out the door, "Have you ever thought about selling the business?" And I said to him, "Sorry." And we got into this very small conversation. I said, "I can't talk right now. I've got to go. My mom was going to the hospital." And they could see that I was going through a terrible, terrible time, And anyway, a bit later that evening, I said to my now wife, Madeline, I said, "This was said to me. I won't mention. Oh, Alex said this to me today." I said, "Really, Al? That doesn't feel like Alex. That sounds a bit odd. He's an FD. He was never a risk taker, and he was now sort of approaching me to say, 'Have you ever thought about buying the business? Because we as a management team might be interested in buying it.'" And I said to her, "It's really weird." So anyway, I couldn't sleep that night, and about 3 a.m, I emailed my solicitor, and I said to her, "Can I look into a member of staff's emails? Because I've had this correspondence and it just feels a bit weird." And she asked me to send over some policies. The next day she said, "Yes, you can." I asked our IT director to do a download dump of all of Alex's emails for the past 3 months. And by the way, a good tip, never, ever read somebody else's emails. You will only find things that you don't want to read about yourself. But I started to find these emails between him and my then non-exec chair and one of my other non-exec directors, and they were colluding to how to approach Jamie to buy the business at the right price. And it was one email in particular that really got to me, because it was an email that said something along the lines of, "I think it's about now is the right time. He's not in a good place." And it sort of suggested that they might be able to buy the business for £8 million, of which I knew it was worth substantially more. That was a really, really low time for me. So I called them in to meet me the following day, all individually, and I sacked them all. there and then, on the basis that there was no way of coming back from this. And I was petrified, and my mum is dying. I've got no senior management team. How am I going to survive? But we pulled it around, and it was the biggest motivator. You know, I'm going to prove to you guys this business isn't worth £8 million. And 2.5 years later, we sold it for 42 million. And they all lost their stock options at the time. So they went, you know, that they made nothing, which I'm very, you know, I'd love for them to have been paid out if they would have behaved themselves and delivered what they were supposed to deliver. But I'm very proud that they didn't make any money from that transaction in the end. But it was a real low moment, and a strong reminder of money makes people do very strange things.
I was going to say, what is the lesson that you would give to people as a result of that, Jamie?
Well, it's an interesting one, because people say, you know, well, would you trust people again? And of course I do. I own 2 majority businesses now that I don't operate in, and I expect my management team to run them well. So I would hate to feel that you would lose trust in society or people because of it, because obviously not everybody is bad. But I guess the reality is I'm not too sure there is a lesson to be learned from it. I'm just that the reality is this will happen to people over and over again, but it's how you respond to it, isn't it? So I responded to it robustly, but I also responded to it without any hate. So a good example of that is a few years ago, I reached out to my FD because I happened to be in Bristol, where he is from, and said to him, do you want to have a coffee? And my wife couldn't believe it. She said, I cannot believe you. Why would you do that? And I said, because, you know, we had many good years together, and I liked him. He was a friend. He was an addict.
Did you have the coffee?
We didn't, unfortunately. It got cancelled, but we have been in communication now loosely on, well, let's make that happen and stuff. And I think it came as a shock to him that I reached out and said, I'm in Bristol, let's have a coffee. But actually I want to have a coffee with him because, you know what, I like him. And I think he probably, well, I'm sure he realizes that he did the wrong thing, and that's enough, right? I don't need to, I'm not going to him for an apology, but, you know, I try not to hold grudges. It's really not worth it.
I think that's very true. And I had a situation where I was, I bought some properties in Cyprus. It turned out to be a bit of a scam. And I then realized I had to sell them because it wasn't going to have a whole team of people who'd resell it and all that kind of stuff. You were left with all these properties off plan. And a friend of mine said he could help me out. He introduced me to a multimillionaire. Turned out the guy wasn't a multimillionaire. He was a fraudster, and he'd been to jail for property fraud in Spain. And he was a fraud. And anyway, I got the 2 of them arrested on bail for what they were doing. But I just couldn't go through with it because there were all sorts of things in my life going on at the time, and I just let it drop. But I did actually have a conversation with him, and I said, did you know that he'd been to jail for property fraud? He went, oh yeah, but Jonathan, he's changed. Like, you knew, and you never told me. And I kept asking you, is this guy straight? Is he legit? Is there anything I should be worried about? Something doesn't feel right. No, he's great. He's a multimillionaire from Sri Lanka, and, you know, he's going to buy your properties. All your problems are going to go away. And he was lying to me. The 2 of them were in cahoots. And I had to drop that. He was godfather to one of my children, and I had to drop that. But actually, recently, I'd thought I'd like to meet him again, not to say, you know, because obviously I've moved on from that, particularly having done the Hoffman process. I just would be interested to meet, because we had many years running around as young officers, him in the Royal Air Force and me in the Army in Cyprus, and we'd shared many funny days and stories. So, but in life, you know, these things happen to you. Which leads me on to the last sort of 3 questions. We'll talk about executive teams, then a book, and then your top tip. Executive teams, when you've got somebody like your experience and mine, where they have lacked integrity or honesty or been devious or whatever it might be, and it's gone toxic, what do you do about the team? You had a clear situation there, but people listening, when you've got somebody in the team who's toxic, what should you do, Jamie?
Oh, you can only act quickly, right? And I know everybody says it's easy to say, much more difficult to do. But I have never, ever once met anybody that's delayed a process of getting rid of someone when they know that they should get rid of them, and has had a better outcome because of it. It is negative in 100% of the occasions. So it's difficult, right? People don't like firing people. And from my experience, a lot of people don't like firing people because they go, well, you know, I've got to do it, and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you don't have to do it. It's better not to do it yourself, but do it.
Yeah.
So don't carry all these morals around with you that, well, it has to be me. Employ someone, bring in a consultant to do it, bring in a consultant for the day to do it, but do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've done that as well. I once had a couple of coaches who were working for the organization I was in, and the way they were with the CEO and the way they were with the receptionist on the front desk, who they were thoroughly obnoxious to and just looked down their noses at her. And yet they sucked up to the CEO. And I said to them, the way you are speak so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying. And it's not for me. And they go, oh, you know, what do they call me? They call me, you know, the guy who fires everybody, you know, the Terminator. That was it, the Terminator, you know, Jonathan the Terminator. I go, yeah, you know, we met in a urinal. And he went, hello, Terminator. I went, hello. You know, what do you say to someone like that? But you know, I can't be having that sort of, and I think as I've got older, I've luckily got more integrated. This is where I talk about the integrated inspiring leadership compass, that when you're disintegrated, bits of it, like your moral compass or your resilience isn't there, or your brand doesn't match who you are. And the more I'm just, if you wake me at 4 a.m, if my wife, you know, taps me on the shoulder and says, what about this? I've read an email. I tell her the truth. You know, I don't have to make up stories or have a story on a story on a story. I mean, this guy who defrauded me in Cyprus, he had stories upon stories. You could see him work out the next story. And then there was a lie upon a lie upon a lie. So that's great advice. Act quickly. It is difficult, but yeah, employ someone or do it yourself. We talked about a couple of books, one on leadership and business and one on health. What would you pick on those two, Jamie?
So on business, you know, my favorite book is Good to Great by Jim Collins, and the reason I love it so much is I think it's actually it's a book. It's a very rare book because it's a complete framework for how to deliver it. So for delivery and scale in a business, I think you can literally buy that book and take a program out of it and deliver it and watch your business thrive. And on personal books, it wouldn't surprise you on sort of health and well-being. It wouldn't surprise you that anything on protein is just really not covered. You know, now there's probably not enough content to write a whole book on it, but it should be front and center of every health and well-being conversation that we all have, because if you get it right, it shreds weight, it improves your sleep, and it improves your mental health. So protein is key, and it's so simple. You don't need supplements. You just need to probably exactly what you're eating now, but in a different order to digest more of it, and the improvements are vast, especially for women.
Yeah. And that's where I think you and I were talking, and I was just listening to Dr. Mark Hyman talk with Jessica Incapesi, who wrote a book called The Glucose Revolution, which I recommend. And she talks about this order, you know, as you said, eat your vegetables first, which gives you that sort of fiber and slows everything down going through the system. Then your protein and your good fats, you know, avocados and nuts and things like that. And then you can have the carbs, as you say, afterwards and end. But don't have a breakfast, which is a dessert. Have a savory breakfast. Don't you know, all this Mr. Kellogg's and all his food that he's convinced you to have, and the sugar's not good.
Well, even a fruit juice, right, Jonathan? So obviously the fruit juice is, you know, we must all stop having fruit juice in the morning. And you go to, I have a daddy-daughter weekend away twice a year with each of my girls, just one-on-one. And we had one this weekend, and we're in a hotel at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. And every time we went for breakfast, the chaps to my daughter, apple juice. And I'm like, no, just no apple juice. Water is fine, right? And another thing, obviously, when you go for dinner in restaurants, the first thing they do is dump a lot of bread while you're waiting for your food. And you start on that stuff. You've taken all of the bad carbohydrates, you get the sugar spice, you're starving hungry when your food arrives. And guess what you're starving hungry for? You're hungry for carbs. So you'll go for the potatoes and the chips and everything else first. And it's creating a complete opposite effect to what you want to be doing. Tell them to bring the bread once they've bought the food, if you want bread with your food. Do not let it land on that table before, because the incentive to eat it is far greater than if it's not there. So would you like bread, sir? Yes, but bring it with my food.
Yeah, yeah, or even as a dessert.
Yes.
It's at the end. No, cracking, and lovely hearing that you've got two daughters. I have, and both of them now 29 or 30, getting married in the next few months, about 3 months apart. But I did just as you did. I have daddy and daughter time, and we go as a threesome. And my wife's very understanding. We go off, and we went to Dubai for 4 nights.
Oh, nice.
And because they knew the girls were getting engaged to be married, one of the guests who I had on the show, Ben Gugamon, spoke to the managing director, and they laid on in the Hilton Dubai this amazing experience on the Palm with the swans made up, roses for the girls, and lovely little chocolate. The girls will never forget it. And then we did, going off the leap of faith, and in a rubber ring, screaming our heads off and yelling airborne as I jumped off some long slide, which was really far too scary for me, who hates heights. But daddy and daughter time, do it throughout your life. It's a really good team. Hey, so would you kindly introduce yourself again? Tell us what you're doing in the 2-minute leadership top tip, and that's the finish, Jamie.
Yeah, so I'm Jamie Waller, and I'm an entrepreneur, adventurer, and philanthropist. And I'm currently chair of the Princess Trust Enterprise Network. I own a number of majority business assets and a large portfolio of minority ones. And I'm currently in the process of writing my second book, The Dyslexic Entrepreneur, and what everyone can learn from thinking differently. And my top leadership point, a tip right now, is to just get going. It's that Nike strap line, just do it. I hear from hundreds of thousands of people every year that are planning and planning and planning. And there's nothing quite like just doing it and getting going.
Jamie, it's been a really inspiring session with you. Thank you for just going free flow as we did. I left a lot of the questions to one side because I just find you so interesting. You are truly inspiring. Thank you to Sandy. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you.